Welcome to DIYEasyCrafts.com. How to make a knife with a rustic scalloped blade and a hybrid scotch brite and walnut micarta scales. Now this particular knife project was actually pretty easy to make. We started with 1095 high carbon steel knife blanks. These are available directly from DIYEasyCrafts.com. They're all 3/16 thick, and they're all cut out with a water jet, so they're exactly the same size and shape and length, etc. And they make a really good starting point for a project like this. The next step was going to be to grind the scallop marks into the blade. And then, of course, I'm going to finish it with brass bolsters, and I wanted to try something a little bit different with the scales or with the handles, and I made up micarta out of a scotch brite pad and paired it with a dark walnut wood in order to finish the scales. That scotch brite micarta gave a really cool swirling effect. Anyway, we're going to start by making the grooves or the scallop marks in the blade. And what makes this type of a knife pretty easy to make is that there's very little finishing involved in it. It's very easy to make a knife very rustic looking. But I happen to like the texture, the textured look. So I used a disc grinder. This has a flap sanding wheel. It's a very coarse wheel. This one's a 36 grit. And I'm just making random grinds. And I'm making them fairly deep, not quite halfway through that 3/16 thickness, but deep enough so that they're gonna really stand out. And the whole principle here is to do all of this grinding and the rough bevels before you send the knife out for heat treating. The heat treating is going to add carbonization, and it's going to darken that blade. And then a little bit of light polishing will leave all of the grooves dark and the surface a little bit shiny. After I used the disc grinder, I went to this rasping tool, which I got at one of the local hardware stores, just to roughen it up even more. So I'm just putting scratches on almost every surface that's going to be visible on the blade, as well as into each one of those grooves. All right, so this is, a hour's worth of work from the blank to this stage. Now I'm going to do the rough grinding of the bevels. Again, this knife by nature is going to be very rough and rustic looking. I'm not using bevel jigs, and I'm not using a plunge jig. I'm just carefully starting at the same point on each side, and I'm trying to hold a similar angle on both sides as I drag it across that 2-inch belt sander. I'm using an 80 grit paper on the belt sander. I'm not going to go to a finer grit. I really want the grind lines to show on the bevels. And just taking my time. Really doesn't take all that long in order to grind down the rough bevels. I'm not going to take these bevels all the way down because after the hardening, I want to just finish those bevels so that the end result is going to have kind of shiny bevels and a dark blade above it. Notice that I've already reamed out the holes in the handle, or the pinholes in the handle. You certainly always want to do that before hardening. Then I gave the knife to my friend Jason Northgard, and he heated it up with his torches until the blade itself was cherry red, non-magnetic, and then quenched it in oil. This is now the blade after it came back from his heat treating, and I'm just going to use a little emery to polish up the top or surface areas of that blade, just to see what the end result, a better idea of what the end result is going to look like. So I want to highlight. I'm not going to completely polish. I'm just going to roughen it up a little bit so that you have a little bit of shiny steel on the surface, but you still have all of those very dark black areas in each one of the grooves. Now it's back to the belt sander, and I'm just going to follow those same bevel angle. I'm going to follow the same bevel angle and grooves just to polish up the bevel on each side and to bring it closer to being sharp. Again, you could certainly go to a finer grit paper. I didn't. I kind of wanted that rustic look, so I'm just leaving the 80 grit paper on the belt sander. Really, the only polishing and the only finish work on this knife is going to be on the scales, on the handles. Now you can use the top of the belt sander away from the platen. This gives a different look. It kind of wraps around the blade, the belt, so it gives you more of a rounded over bevel. Really just depends on what your preference is, what you want the finished product to look like. So the blade is basically done at this point. Now I'm going to move to the brass bolsters, and I just cut out some rough shapes of what I wanted them to look like. I finished the front edge, or the curve on the front edge, and then I glue them into position with 2-part epoxy and 1/8 inch diameter brass pins. And then I clamp them in a vise, and I add a couple extra clamps. I let this, completely dry, usually overnight. And once that's dry, then I'll go back and I'll finish grinding those bolsters to the actual size of the knife, either with the belt sander or with a Dremel grinder. Everybody does a lot of these things at different ways. This is certainly not the only way of doing it or the right way of doing it. It's just demonstrating how I do it. So now the bolsters are attached to the blade. The blade itself is finished. And now I'm going to move to the handles. So I'm experimenting with something different. I like to do this kind of frequently. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. I found these Scotch Brite pads at the local supermarket, and I thought that it might make a decent material in order to make micarta handles or micarta scales out of. So all I'm using is regular standard fiberglass resin. I'm adding a little bit of black paint, oil-based modeler's paint to it, and then I'm going to just pour that right over this bright blue Scotch Brite pad. You could certainly get a variety of different effects. I probably went a little bit heavy on the black. I could have used less black, or I could have used a different color completely. I could have used a darker blue, or even a clear resin. But I went with black. I'm going to pour it over the Scotch Brite pad. I'm just going to use a stick to kind of make sure that liquid resin covers every single area and gets absorbed into that Scotch Brite pad completely. I do have that Scotch Brite pad sitting in a container and on top of some wax paper, and that just helps it separate later. I'm going to lay another piece of wax paper on top of it, and I'm going to weight it down just with a paver that I had around. Unlike paper micarta, where you really want to press it, I don't really want to flatten this out too much. It's already thin enough. All I'm looking for is that blue swirling design once I grind away into this micarta. So this is now hardened, and at this point I think it's going to actually look pretty good. You can start to see some of those blue swirls really without me even doing any grinding. Now, unfortunately, this piece of Scotch Brite, or the Scotch Brite pad itself, is not really large enough to make two scales out of, two complete scales. But I did want to use it on this project. So what I ended up doing was just cutting off a couple of small sections, and I'm going to use it just as a highlight in between the brass bolsters and the walnut scales. So I cut a couple of small pieces. I ended up gluing them onto the walnut just with some 2-part epoxy. I let them dry completely, and then I drilled the holes through them and attached them to the knife blade just like you would any scales. So I attach it with 2-part epoxy as well as 1/4 inch brass pins, and then I'm going to use the belt sander again in order to start to finish these handles off. The belt sander really goes through this material pretty quickly. It's one of the parts of knife making that I seem to enjoy the most, is working on the scales or on the handles. And now this, you can see that they're starting to take shape. I'm dipping it in the water because those brass pins get very hot from the belt sander. You want to keep all of that stuff cool. And I'm going to finish off the sanding or the grinding and shaping of these scales with a little Dremel grinder. I happen to love these little drum sanding wheels. They do a great job. And then after I'm done with this, I'll just use a regular oscillating sander with a 220 grit paper, or even sand a little bit by hand. This is the finished product. So it's a very rustic, it's got scallop grooves in the blade, brass bolsters. This is that Scotch Brite micarta, black fiberglass resin mixed with a bright blue Scotch Brite pad. Gave a kind of a unique look to the handle, and that's matched with walnut scales behind it. Another look at the finished product. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, I ask that you please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to this YouTube channel. Please check us out on the web at DIYEasyCrafts.com. Be sure to check out all of our other how-to knife making videos, as well as a variety of other do-it-yourself crafts. Thank you very much.